My name is Darren Booth. I head up the cybersecurity and privacy practice at RSM in Melbourne. So that's everything from doing technical penetration testing through to looking at the processes and controls around security, through to developing strategies and implementing controls to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber risks. So I'll probably start with a quick question. I'm looking around the room, not too sure how many hands I'll get here, but who here is 35 years or under? We got a couple, all right. That was a bit more than I thought, okay. So that was the last, or that was when the Privacy Act was written. So you think about that, 35 years ago was when the legislation was written that governs information and data today. So 35 years ago, we had a very different world, very different world. Floppy disks, they were the main mechanism for actually transferring information. Some people may not even know what a floppy disk is, but it's a little square piece of plastic that would hold maybe 1 megabit of data, not even that. Big data didn't exist. Big data back then was 1 gigabyte. The cloud didn't exist. Biometric data didn't exist. Geolocations of your computers didn't exist. Smartphones didn't exist. So you've now got this legislation that is governing everything that we do on a day-to-day basis that is 35 years old. Now, there have been a couple of tweaks along the way. They've introduced the Notifiable data breaches scheme, which basically means if there's been a breach, under certain circumstances, you need to notify the Office of the Information Commissioner. And they've also just recently introduced the higher penalties, but that was basically in response to the Optus breach, where they realized that the highest penalty that they could have fined them would have been $3 million, which is a drop in the ocean. So the world's changed, and the government luckily did recognize this and had started a process already prior to the big breaches of last year around Medibank and Optus to really look at, is the data privacy legislation in Australia fit for purpose? Now, the Office of the Attorney General produced a report last month, and as part of that, they've proposed some recommendations that are going to have fundamental changes to how organisations do business, not even just around how they manage information, but how they actually do business on a day-to-day basis. Some of the key changes are the scope that currently the Privacy Act applies to. So if you're an organisation that's got an annual turnover of less than $3 million, you actually don't need to worry about the Privacy Act. You're not required to comply with the data privacy legislation. So if you're a small organisation, that might be a good thing because it allows you to be nimble, it allows you to do things that might allow you to get a step up. But it does then carve out a large proportion of the Australian economy, given that the small to medium enterprises is actually quite a large footprint in Australia. The introduction of the right to deletion. In Australia, whilst you might ask for your information to be deleted and a nice organisation might do that, that's actually not ingrained in legislation. So this aligns very much with some of the legislation in Europe, where if you use an organisation for a particular transaction, once that transaction finished, you can then say, I now want my data to be deleted because you no longer require it for the services that you had provided to me or need to continue to provide to me. So things like, do you need a driving licence as part of the application? Well, you might need to verify someone's identity, but then do you then need to retain that going forward? So that whole right of deletion, if it comes in the manner that is being proposed as part of the privacy review, would give individuals the power to basically say, once you've finished with my data, I now want you to delete it, provided it didn't conflict with other Australian legislation. So things like if you're taking out a loan, well, there's certain information you're going to have to keep for 7 years regardless. The inclusion of employee records. So you might not realise that if you're an employee, your information is not actually governed by the Privacy Act. All the customer information is, but you as an employee provide all this information to your employer. So you've got background checks, you might have some health information, you've got all your employment, you've got your date of birth, your address, your next of kin. That information isn't actually covered by the Privacy Act. So again, that's a massive increase in scope if that is brought into scope. And this is then where it starts impacting not just the IT department, but the human resources department. The right to delete data, that will impact potentially business intelligence, how you're actually sort of interacting from a customer experience point of view. How do you actually use information to make decisions if that information needs to be deleted? The other big change, and there's a whole pile of other ones on here that align with a really just increase and changing some of the thresholds, but the other big one is really around this requirement to fairly and reasonably process, store, transmit the information. Now, there is already a principle that is partially aligned to this under the current Privacy Act, but the fair and reasonable test does increase the threshold. And more around actually how do you demonstrate that your decision to process information has been done in a fair and reasonable manner. So as part of doing that, what we think is going to happen as part of the requirements and the guidelines that will come out to support this will be guidance around saying, well, you don't just need to be able to demonstrate that it is fair and reasonable. You need to be able to demonstrate how you got to that determination. How did you, at the very start, determine that the information that you were collecting and retaining was fair and reasonable? So that's then going to require you to document data flows, work through how the data sort of transfers and moves through your organization, who's actually interacting with that information. That's a massive piece of work for organizations that have quite complex processes and quite a lot of information as well. So there are some fundamental changes that are coming. They're not here yet, so there's a little bit of a breather. But the consultation is currently open with the Privacy Act review report. That will close at the end of 2023, and then we're expecting then sort of probably 12 to 24 months after that, both the implementation and a timeline to implement as well. So it's definitely something to get on the radar if you're not already thinking about privacy and the data that you've got. The world's going to change and you are going to have to start thinking about it in the very near future. So why has privacy become such a hot topic? And like I mentioned, it was a hot topic before Medibank and Optus last year. And what you can see on this particular graphic is sort of Medibank and Optus down at the bottom there. So this is a snapshot of data that was obtained from the ABC, by the ABC, from the Office of the Information Commissioner. And what they did is basically say, well, what notifiable breaches have you had over the past couple of years? And basically sort of close to 3,000 since 2022. Since 2020. Some of these are a little bit nuanced in some of the sizing. So 69 million records for Neopets. That was a global organization that also had Australian citizens in it. So therefore, a notification was made to OAC in relation to it. So obviously not 69 million Australians, because there aren't 69 million Australians. But it goes to show the types of breaches that are being notified through to OAC. What it doesn't show you is this is just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a couple of carve-outs that isn't included in this data. State government. So federal government needs to comply with the Federal Privacy Act. State government needs to comply with State Privacy Act, and therefore they don't need to report through to OAC. So if there's a state government breach, it won't appear in these records. We talked earlier around employees. So if it's an employee data breach, that won't be included in here. Under $3 million of annual revenue, that wouldn't be included here, or that would likely be a small dot in relation to this. The other thing is the threshold of what is notifiable. There's a threshold around, is it going to cause harm to the individuals? And that's up to the organization themselves to determine. And if they determine yes, they make a notification through to OAC. If they determine no, then they don't. And no one's any the wiser in relation to what actually has occurred. So there's a whole raft of breaches that occur that don't actually make its way through to OAC because the determination by the organization is that it doesn't meet that harm threshold. But what it did do is basically made the government look and say, well, we do need to make these changes. And you've got to look at why do these breaches actually occur. So for the period of July 2020 through to December 2022, July 2022 to December 2022, there was about 500 breaches notified through to OAC. About 25% of them was human error. So that's where someone emailed the information, left it on a USB on a train, or dropped it outside. So 25% was real, the person was to blame and fully to blame for that. About 5% was due to system error, so the system did something that it shouldn't have done and sent it out. 70% was a malicious attack. Now, of those 70%, 50% of them related to a human attack vector. So what that means is it's a phishing attack. It's a user credential that was breached or was disclosed and used somewhere else. And therefore, the numbers are actually quite scary in relation to the human part of a breach as opposed to just the technology side of things. So we talk about in cybersecurity, people, processes, technologies. And IT can, to a certain extent, take care of the technology side of things, but the people really gets into that culture side of things, which sort of Vicky touched on earlier. Culture and awareness and that skepticism in relation to what you're doing is one of the key controls that you as an organization have to protect your organization. There's also processes, and processes obviously still have an impact as well. So business email compromise. If you're in finance and you get an invoice that just doesn't feel right, well, that could be because an email system of one of your vendors has been breached. They've then sent you through a fake invoice or changed the invoice and then sent that through and said, oh, just pay this through to this different bank account. That's a process failure potentially in your organization. If that process hasn't had checks and balances in it to identify that could have been a malicious invoice. So really it's around being aware that technology isn't the only fix for cyber. It is also the combination of people and processes as well. So if you're a non-technology person, what are the key things that you want to be thinking about in relation to cybersecurity? And some of these questions whilst they may have a technical answer, they don't actually require you to be technical in relation to necessarily understand and ask the question in the first place. So, do you have a security incident response plan? Is it a piece of paper? Is it something that is actively tested on an annual basis? Is your name in it? Do you actually know what your role and responsibility is should there actually be a security breach? Do you realize that as part of a security breach, it's not just IT that are involved, it's PR, it's legal, it's operations if you need to take your systems down from a business continuity perspective. It's the executives who need to make decisions in relation to, are we going to turn our systems offline? Are we actually going to make a communication through to the customers in a public manner? There's a lot of very non-technical people that need to be involved in those decisions, and they need to understand their role in a security response. Managing third-party risk. If you're using software as a service, well, you might be doing that without even your IT team knowing about it, because you can go and give some credit card information, get access to an app, upload that information and start using that app without even the IT being involved in it. Do you actually understand what third parties have access to your systems? So if you look at the recent Latitude breach, that was a third party who was responsible for managing their technologies. Their account got breached, which then allowed the hacker to then get inside Latitude systems and then get access to a whole pile of information. So it's around understanding what are those risks outside of just your environment and your employees and your technology. Elsewhere, who else are you allowing into, and who else have you given the keys to the kingdom? The lastly then is just then reaching out and sort of realizing there is external support that's available and having some of that ready to go up front and understanding where are your gaps. So doing assessments along the way, asking those questions of, do we actually know where our issues are? As is always the case, if you don't know what you don't know, then you're none the wiser. So get assessments done, whether that's a technical penetration test or asking management to make presentations around what are the key things they're doing. really just ask those questions or get people in to ask those questions and make sure that you're prepared should something happen. I think it is really around some of the data that organizations hold that they just don't realize. So as part of a customer onboarding journey, you might be collecting a whole raft of information that you then just assume has been deleted from your system because they're now a customer, and therefore you don't need that information because they're already onboarded, and therefore you think it's gone. But actually it's in a database over here, or it's actually just just part of your core data set, and then realizing that if you did have a breach, you've now got, driving licenses, passports, sensitive information that might even be around sort of health information as well. And it does go into the types of things that Optus and Medibank have really been in the press around, is the volume of information that can then be linked with other information from other breaches that then builds up this picture that allows an attacker to have a very comprehensive picture of an individual that they can then do something with. I think it is very much a maturity thing. So there are those organizations that have been on a cybersecurity journey for a long time. They've probably ticked the boxes from a couple of the key controls from a prevention perspective. And now they're then going, okay, so we think we've got the moat up around our data. What data do we actually have in here? What's next? Or they've realized that actually to protect all their information, they're spending a lot of money. They actually want to target that a bit better and focus their spend on a particular data set. Those organizations are on the journey to go through that data governance, data cleansing journey. But if you think 5 years ago, it was all around what data can you get? Big data. Let's get whatever data we can harvest to analyze, to build up a picture of our customers. That's the mindset change that's has come in the past year. And I don't think organizations have quite caught up there in relation to what that means for their systems. It's a tool in the arsenal. It's definitely not the be-all and end-all, and it's not the thing that's going to fix things. If you're using cyber insurance, you're in trouble already, because you've already had a breach and you're basically using it to basically claw back some money. That doesn't help you necessarily from a reputation perspective and everything else, but it still is something that can be useful. It really requires a due diligence around what are the carve-outs. Active war. So a lot of time that's carved out. So if, as part of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, there's an attack that maybe is on the Ukraine finance systems, that then goes out further around other companies, that might not be covered as part of your cyber insurance policy. If it says you must do an annual pen test and you don't, well, your insurance is void. If it says you have to have a disaster recovery plan, and you had it from 5 years ago and hasn't been tested, they'll use that to basically say, well, we're going to reduce your premiums, reduce your payout because you're actually partially responsible for the amount of effort that's gone into that recovery. So you've really got to do your diligence around it, and then it is a cost-benefit analysis. We've got a lot of companies that self-insure because they have now got to the point of it's just either too expensive or the carve-outs are so big that they've decided it's not worth it. We've got the same number that go for it still, regardless. Blockchain's a technology, and like all technologies, it has issues. There's a number of security breaches that have come through blockchain organizations. Fundamentally, the technology is sound. It is a secure by design architecture, but what you've still got to remember is that it is people and organizations that are implementing that technology. So there are still then gaps in relation to how that's being done. So whilst you might not necessarily be able to manipulate the ledger, you can manipulate things that then result in the ledger being correct, but having information that is malicious, or sorry, not malicious. It is information that is has been changed prior to getting on the ledger. So if you look at a lot of the Bitcoin breaches, hundreds of millions of dollars because they've manipulated the Bitcoin system that is using a blockchain technology underneath it. So there's ways. So it really comes into, again, thinking through. It's not I don't think it is the silver bullet, but it can be a tool that can help understand and be used as a security mechanism. Probably 5-10 years ago, cloud definitely had a bad name. It was always, there's a breach in the cloud, there's a breach in the cloud. Fundamentally, the cloud's secure in that, and you've got to remember, the cloud is just a computer that's managed by someone else. Okay, all it is AWS have joined a whole pile of computers together, and they've called it the AWS cloud. So it's still, again, the fundamentals of a computer system, but the cloud that AWS have built, or Microsoft Azure, or Google, GCP, or I'm trying to say a whole pile here, so it's not necessarily plugging any particular vendor more than the other. But fundamentally, what they have built is a technology platform that is secure because they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to implement security on it. Where the cloud then has a weakness is that organizations then come along and people come along and they say, it's in the cloud, it's all secure. What you've got to realize is there's a shared responsibility model. The cloud providers will protect everything below the line, so at the platform and infrastructure layer. You're still responsible for where you deploy your systems and who you allow access to the systems and how you configure your firewalls. So if you deploy a system that is on the cloud but on the wrong side of a firewall, well, that's going to be a real fundamental issue, that all that data on that system is going to be publicly available. So you've really got to realize that there are levers that you're pulling as part of an implementation or a transformation to a cloud that you're responsible for, as well as relying on their technologies at that core infrastructure layer. And there's then a lot of configurations, depending on which platform you go for. There's more configurations or less configurations that, again, turning on and off will make it less or more secure. So you really ought to understand what you're getting into, and realizing that a cloud implementation is very different to a on-premise implementation, which then gets into different skill sets and different tools that sort of help it in relation to managing that risk.